I was 32 years old when a single text message saved my life and destroyed my entire family. I was sitting at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Saint Barts, playing the role of the grateful estranged daughter who had finally been welcomed back into the fold after 23 years. But as my white brother-in-law literally kicked an $80,000 dinner bill at my feet, and my mother watched with a cold smirk, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. The message was from a man who had been dead to me for decades. It told me to run. What I found waiting for me at the airport when I landed shattered every lie I had ever been told and revealed a conspiracy so dark it made me question my own sanity. "You are just the bastard stray they picked up." Liam spat the words across the white linen tablecloth. He reached into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored linen suit and pulled out his heavy metal black card. Instead of handing it to the waiter who stood trembling nearby, Liam threw it onto the polished mahogany floor. He then picked up the leather folder containing the bill for our private dining room and kicked it sharply under the table. The folder slid across the expensive wood and hit the tip of my designer heel. "Mother Beatrice pitied you enough to bring you along on this family vacation, so know your place and pay for the meal." Liam leaned back in his chair, swirling the dregs of a $5,000 bottle of wine. "Or does your pathetic accountant's salary not even cover the vintage I just drank?" I looked down at the leather folder resting against my shoe. I did not cry. I did not flinch. As a forensic accountant who spent her days tracking hidden assets and uncovering corporate fraud, I was trained to observe the details that other people missed. I looked at Liam. How was a hedge fund manager who prided himself on his aggressive negotiation tactics, but right now his pupils were slightly dilated, and a thin sheen of sweat coated his forehead despite the cool ocean breeze blowing through the open terrace doors. He was not just arrogant, he was anxious. My mother Beatrice sat at the head of the table. She was the undisputed queen of Atlanta socialites, a woman who controlled charity boards and country club guest lists with an iron fist. She slowly raised her crystal flute of champagne to her perfectly painted lips and took a deliberate sip. She did not reprimand her son-in-law for his blatant disrespect. Instead, her eyes locked onto mine and she offered a smile that held absolutely no warmth. "Liam is right, Zuri." Beatrice said, her voice smooth and carefully modulated to ensure the surrounding tables of billionaires could hear every word. "When you were 9 years old, your father threw you out onto the street with a single $100 bill because you were entirely useless. You have spent your whole life clawing your way up from the dirt. Do not make me regret my charity in inviting you back into this family. You should consider paying this bill a small tax for the privilege of breathing the same air as us tonight." Next to Liam, my younger sister Chloe let out a high-pitched laugh. She was the golden child, the one who had been raised in the lap of luxury, while I was forced to survive on my own. Chloe raised her left hand to the candlelight, making sure the massive new diamond ring Liam had just bought her caught the maximum amount of glare. "Honestly, Zuri, you should be thanking Liam for giving you the opportunity to contribute." Chloe chimed in, smoothing down her silk dress. "We all know you only agreed to come on this healing vacation because you wanted a taste of how real money lives. The least you can do is cover the dinner. It is only $80,000. If you cannot afford it, maybe you should go back to whatever miserable little apartment you crawled out of." I sat perfectly still, absorbing their venom. For 23 years, I had wondered why my family had suddenly reached out to me. A month ago, Beatrice had sent a tearful letter claiming she wanted to make amends before my 32nd birthday. She claimed my father had been a monster who forced her to abandon me, and now that he had been dead for years, she wanted her eldest daughter back. I had agreed to this trip to Saint Barts, not because I believed her tears, but because I needed to understand what she really wanted. People like Beatrice Washington never did anything out of guilt. They only moved when there was profit to be made or power to be secured. I reached down and picked up the leather folder. The grand total printed at the bottom was exactly $82,400. I could pay it. I had built a highly successful career dismantling the financial lies of corrupt executives. My net worth was something they knew absolutely nothing about because I kept my assets entirely off the public grid. I opened my clutch, preparing to pull out my own card to end the scene quietly so I could continue observing their strange behavior. Right at that moment, my phone buzzed violently against my palm. I glanced down at the screen. The caller ID was blocked, but the text message displayed clearly on the locked screen. Fly home. Do not say anything to your parents. They are not who you think they are. Signed Sterling. My breath caught in my throat. Sterling. That was the last name of the attorney who had worked exclusively for my late father. The man who had managed my father's mysterious estate after he died in a horrific car crash 20 years ago. Sterling had never contacted me, not once in my entire life. For him to send an encrypted message right at this exact moment meant one thing. The invisible tripwire I had been sensing all week had just been snapped. My forensic brain immediately began connecting the dots. The sudden invitation to reconcile, the insistence that we travel to a foreign territory where U.S. jurisdiction did not apply. The fact that Liam had insisted on booking a private yacht excursion for tomorrow morning. Just the four of us far out in the deep waters of the Caribbean. The way Beatrice kept casually asking me earlier today if I had updated my beneficiaries recently. They were not here to humiliate me into paying for a dinner. They were here to kill me. I needed to get off this island immediately. But if I showed any sign of panic, they would know I was on to them. Liam was already watching me like a hawk, waiting for me to react to his insult. I needed a diversion. I picked up my full glass of red wine and made a deliberate show of fumbling with my clutch. I let my wrist twist sharply, sending the dark crimson liquid splashing all over the front of my light-colored dress. "Oh my God," I gasped, standing up quickly and knocking my chair back. The wine dripped down the fabric, creating a massive stain. Chloe groaned in loud disgust. "Look what you did. You are so incredibly clumsy, Zuri. That dress is completely ruined." Not that it was a designer label anyway. Beatrice sighed, rubbing her temples as if my very existence was a migraine. "Go to the restroom and clean yourself up, Zuri. You are embarrassing us in front of the entire restaurant. Make sure you leave your credit card with the waiter before you go." I placed my standard bank debit card on the table, making sure it was the one linked to my smallest account. "I am so sorry," I stammered, pitching my voice higher to sound flustered and humiliated. "I will be right back. Please go ahead and run the card." Liam smirked, looking incredibly satisfied with himself. "Do not take too long, Stray. We have an early morning tomorrow. The yacht leaves the dock at 6 sharp, and we want to get far out into the ocean before the sun gets too hot." I nodded, keeping my head down in a posture of complete submission. I walked away from the table, feeling their arrogant gazes burning into my back. As soon as I rounded the corner out of their line of sight, my entire demeanor shifted. The trembling stopped. My posture straightened. The scared, rejected daughter vanished and the forensic investigator took over. I walked briskly past the luxury restrooms and headed straight for the bustling kitchen doors. A waiter tried to stop me, but I flashed a crisp $100 bill and pointed toward the service exit, muttering something about needing fresh air for motion sickness. He pocketed the money and stepped aside. I pushed through the heavy metal doors and burst out into the humid Caribbean night air. The service alley was filled with delivery vans and exhaust fumes. I ripped off the restrictive heels I was wearing and threw them into a nearby dumpster. I had worn a pair of flat, flexible sandals in my tote bag precisely because I never went anywhere without a backup plan. I slipped them on and sprinted down the cobblestone street toward the main road. My heart hammered against my ribs as I hailed a passing local taxi. I threw open the door and slid into the back seat, keeping my head down. "The private airstrip," I told the driver in French, "and I will give you triple your fare if you get me there in under 10 minutes. The driver hit the gas and the taxi surged forward, leaving the glowing lights of the Michelin restaurant far behind. I pulled out my phone and quickly typed a message to my private aviation broker in Atlanta. I needed a jet on the runway right now. Cost was not an issue. As the taxi sped through the winding island roads, I looked down at my hands. They were perfectly steady. For 23 years, I had carried the heavy burden of being the unwanted child, the ugly duckling cast out of the glorious Washington family empire. I had cried myself to sleep as a teenager, wondering why my own flesh and blood despised me so much. I had spent my entire adulthood trying to prove my worth to a void. But tonight, sitting in the back of that speeding taxi, looking at the cryptic text message from my father's old lawyer, The puzzle pieces finally began to lock into place. Liam kicking the bill at me was not just a display of power, it was a distraction. They wanted me feeling small and worthless, so I would obediently step onto that yacht tomorrow morning. My phone vibrated again. A notification popped up from my bank. Liam had attempted to charge the $80,000 to the debit card I left on the table. The card only had a limit of $2,000. The transaction had been declined. I smiled a cold, humorless smile. Let them deal with the restaurant manager. Let them feel the humiliation of having their card declined in front of the billionaires they tried so hard to impress. I was done paying for their lifestyle. I was done playing the victim in their twisted family drama. The taxi screeched to a halt outside the small private aviation terminal. I handed the driver a stack of cash and ran toward the glowing lights of the tarmac. The engines of a sleek Gulfstream jet were already whining to life, cutting through the quiet island night. The flight coordinator rushed out to meet me holding a clipboard. "Miss Washington," she called out over the roar of the engines. "We received your emergency request. You are cleared for a direct flight to Atlanta." I bypassed the terminal completely and walked straight up the stairs of the jet. The moment the cabin door sealed shut behind me, I felt a fraction of the tension leave my shoulders. But I knew the real battle had not even begun. Sterling had warned me not to say anything. He had warned me they were not who I thought they were. As the jet taxied down the runway and lifted off into the dark sky over the Atlantic Ocean, I pulled out my secure laptop. I had 3 hours before I landed in Atlanta. 3 hours to prepare for whatever Sterling and the authorities had waiting for me. I did not know yet what secrets my dead father had buried, or why my mother wanted me dead just days before my 32nd birthday. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The scared little girl who was thrown out of the house with $100 bill was dead. And the woman flying back to Atlanta was going to burn their fake empire to the ground. The flight took exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes, but sitting in the quiet cabin of the Gulfstream, it felt like an eternity. I stared out the small oval window, watching the dark expanse of the ocean slowly give way to the sprawling amber lights of the Georgia coastline. My mind was a whirlwind of calculations and risk assessments. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my life dismantling complex webs of corporate fraud, tracing shell companies, and exposing executives who thought they were untouchable. But nothing could have prepared me for the audit of my own family. When the wheels of this private jet finally touched down on the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a heavy sense of dread settled in my stomach. The engines whined as we taxied toward the private aviation terminal. I gathered my tote bag, my fingers gripping the leather handles so tightly my knuckles turned white. I walked down the steps of the jet expecting to find my usual driver waiting by a black town car. Instead, 2 men in dark suits stood directly at the bottom of the stairs. The taller man had the unmistakable rigid posture of federal law enforcement. The other man was older, perhaps in his late 60s, leaning slightly on a wooden cane and clutching a battered leather briefcase to his chest. "Zuri Washington," the taller man said. His voice was deep and commanded absolute authority. "I am Special Agent Davis, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This man to my right is Attorney Sterling. We need you to come with us immediately." I did not panic. I simply nodded. When you spend your life uncovering the darkest financial secrets of the elite, you learn that panic is a luxury you cannot afford. I followed them across the damp tarmac and through a side door of the terminal, bypassing customs and security entirely. They led me down a long, windowless corridor with buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. We entered a small, sterile interrogation room. The walls were painted a dull gray, and a single metal table sat in the center with 3 chairs. "Please sit," Agent Davis said, gesturing to the chair on my side of the table. I sat down, placing my tote bag on the floor. I looked at the older man. "You sent the text message," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You told me to fly home and not to say anything." Attorney Sterling let out a long, trembling breath. He sat down heavily across from me and placed his leather briefcase on the metal table. "Yes, I did," he replied. "And I thank God every second that you listened to me. If you had stayed on that island, you would have been dead by tomorrow morning." The words hung in the sterile air of the room. I felt a cold chill wash over my skin, but my mind immediately compartmentalized the threat. Explain, I said simply. Agent Davis leaned against the concrete wall and crossed his arms. 3 weeks ago, your mother, Beatrice, and your brother-in-law, Liam, finalized the paperwork on a life insurance policy. It is a highly specialized international policy, written through a shadow firm in the Cayman Islands. The policy names the two of them as the sole beneficiaries. And what is the payout, I asked, though I already knew it would be astronomical. $50 million, Agent Davis said without blinking. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. $50 million. I supposed I should be flattered that my mother valued my life at such a high premium. But a life insurance policy requires a signature and a medical exam. I never signed anything. Liam manages a hedge fund that is currently bleeding capital, Agent Davis continued. He has access to international wealth managers who specialize in creating forged identities and backdating corporate documents. They forged your signature. But a forged signature on an offshore policy is useless if the insurance investigators find foul play. They needed an ironclad accident. They needed a tragedy that could not be disputed. Sterling reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick file folder. Tomorrow morning you were scheduled to go on a private yacht excursion with them. Just the four of you, far out in the deep waters where the Coast Guard rarely patrols. I remembered Liam practically gloating at the dinner table about the yacht leaving at 6 sharp. I remembered my sister Chloe laughing. The plan was simple, Agent Davis said. Beatrice obtained a highly potent, untraceable sedative. They were going to drug your morning coffee. Once you were incapacitated, Liam was going to press your thumbprint onto a digital transfer deed. A document that legally surrendered any and all claims you might ever have against the Washington family estate. Once they had your biometric signature, they were going to throw your unconscious body overboard. I stared at the metal table, my mind processing the sheer brutality of the plan. They were going to stage a drowning, a tragic accident on a family healing vacation. The authorities in Saint Barts would have found my body days later if they found it at all. My mother would have played the grieving parent shedding tears for the local news cameras while quietly collecting a $50 million payout to save Liam from his hedge fund collapse. My own mother, I whispered, the reality finally piercing through my analytical shield. My own sister, they were going to watch me drown. Beatrice is not just a socialite, Agent, Davis said, his voice softening slightly. She is the central node in a massive money laundering syndicate. She has been washing money for international crime rings through the family real estate empire for over 2 decades. Your brother-in-law Liam is just the latest pawn she recruited to handle the offshore accounts. They are desperate, Zuri. The syndicate is demanding their money back and Liam lost it in bad investments. They needed that $50 million payout to save their own lives. I looked up at Attorney Sterling. Why now, I asked. Why wait 23 years to invite me back into their lives just to kill me? If they needed money, they could have targeted someone else. Why go through the trouble of tracking down the daughter they threw away? Sterling unclasped the brass buckles of his briefcase. His hands were shaking as he pulled out a heavily encrypted laptop. He placed it on the table and opened the screen. Because tomorrow is your 32nd birthday, he said quietly. And Beatrice recently discovered a secret that your father hid from her. A secret that activates at midnight tonight. Sterling typed a long string of passwords into the laptop. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a profound sorrow that I did not understand. For 23 years, you have believed that your father hated you, he said. You believed he threw you out of the house because you were a disappointment. Because you were not perfect like Chloe. I swallowed hard, the old familiar sting of rejection rising in my throat. He did hate me, I said, my voice trembling slightly. He dragged me to the front door when I was 9 years old. He threw a single $100 bill at my feet and told me I was useless. He told me to never come back. Beatrice stood right next to him and watched. Sterling shook his head, tears welling in his aged eyes. No, Zuri. Your father loved you more than anything in this world, and what he did that night was the only way he could save your life. Sterling turned the laptop toward me and pressed play. The screen was dark for a moment before the grainy image of a man appeared. It was my father, Richard Washington. He looked exactly as I remembered him from when I was a little girl. He was wearing a dark suit, but his tie was loosened and his collar was unbuttoned. He looked incredibly tired. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights and a crushing weight that he carried alone. "Hello, Zuri," my father said, his deep voice echoing from the laptop speakers. It was a voice I had not heard in over 2 decades. "If you are watching this video, it means Sterling has finally found you. It means you are alive. And it means my plan actually worked." I stared at the screen, completely paralyzed. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. "I do not have much time," my father continued on the recording, looking nervously over his shoulder. "I need to tell you the truth before Beatrice realizes what I have done. Your mother is a very dangerous woman, Suri. I discovered 3 months ago that she has been using the Washington group to launder money for a violent criminal organization. When I confronted her, she laughed in my face. She told me that if I tried to go to the police, she would use you as the scapegoat. She had already forged documents naming you as the shadow director of the fraudulent shell companies. You were only 9 years old, but she was setting you up to take the fall if the federal government ever investigated." I felt all the blood drain from my face. I looked at Agent Davis, who gave a slow, grim nod, confirming everything my father was saying. "I could not let her destroy your life," my father said, tears freely falling down his cheeks on the video. "I could not let her use my beautiful, brilliant daughter as a human shield for her crimes. But Beatrice is smart. She monitors everything I do. If she thought I loved you, if she thought I was trying to protect you, she would have used you as leverage to keep me quiet. I had to make her believe that I despised you. I had to make her believe that you meant absolutely nothing to me." My father leaned closer to the camera, his eyes pleading with me through the decades of time. "I had to break your heart, Suri. I had to drag you to that door and scream at you. I had to throw that money at your feet and watch you cry. It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my entire life. Every word I screamed at you tore my soul into pieces. But I had to make it a public spectacle. I had to make Beatrice believe that I was discarding you like trash. Because once you were gone, once you were out of this house and legally emancipated from our household, she could no longer tie you to her financial crimes." A choked sob escaped my lips. I covered my mouth with both hands, tears blinding my vision. The memory of that night, the trauma that had defined my entire existence, had been a calculated performance. A desperate father playing the role of a monster just to get his child out of the line of fire. "But I did not just send you away with nothing," my father continued, wiping his face. "Before I kicked you out, I liquidated 60% of the voting shares of the Washington Group. I placed them into an irrevocable blind trust managed by Sterling. Beatrice thinks those shares were lost in a bad offshore investment. She has spent the last 2 decades trying to rebuild her control over the board. But she does not know that the trust is programmed to transfer full ownership to you on your 32nd birthday." My father smiled a sad, proud smile. "I knew you would survive, Zuri. I knew you would grow up to be strong and brilliant. I set the transfer for your 32nd birthday because I knew by then you would be powerful enough to fight her. I know Beatrice cut the brakes on my car. I know I am not going to survive this week. She thinks she has won. She thinks she is going to inherit the empire and continue her crimes. But she is just keeping the seat warm for you." The video glitched slightly before my father spoke his final words. "I am so sorry I caused you so much pain, my sweet girl. Do not mourn me. Avenge me. Take back what is yours. I love you. I have always loved you." The screen went black. The interrogation room was dead silent except for the harsh, ragged sound of my own breathing. For 23 years, I had built a fortress around my heart. I had convinced myself that I was unlovable, that I was flawed, that my own father had looked at me and seen nothing but a burden. I had used that pain as fuel to become a relentless forensic accountant, punishing corrupt people because I could not punish the man who broke me. And now, sitting in this cold concrete room, the fortress crumbled into dust. My father did not hate me. He loved me so fiercely that he willingly died a brutal death just to buy me time to grow up. He had sacrificed his reputation, his relationship with me, and ultimately his own life, so that I could sit here today as a free woman. The psychological shock was an earthquake tearing through my mind. The revelation that my mother was a cold-blooded killer who had spent decades plotting my demise collided violently with the agonizing truth of my father's unimaginable sacrifice. It was too much. The human mind is not built to process that magnitude of betrayal and love simultaneously. I tried to speak. I wanted to tell Sterling that I understood. I wanted to tell Agent Davis that I was ready to help them destroy Beatrice and Liam. But my throat closed up. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin. My chest tightened as if a steel band was being ratcheted around my ribs. Miss Washington, Agent Davis said, his voice suddenly sounding like it was coming from underwater. Are you all right? I gripped the edge of the metal table, my knuckles turning white. The room began to spin. The gray walls tilted at impossible angles. The harsh fluorescent lights above me flared brightly, burning my eyes. I could hear Sterling shouting for a medic, but his voice was drowned out by a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The image of my father's tear-stained face flashed behind my eyelids. His final words echoed in the dark chambers of my mind. Avenge me. Take back what is yours. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt like lead. The agonizing weight of 23 years of stolen grief crashed down upon my shoulders all at once. The pain in my chest exploded, robbing me of my remaining breath. The edges of my vision darkened, turning into a narrow tunnel. I felt myself pitching forward, slipping off the metal chair. The last thing I felt was the cold concrete floor rushing up to meet me before the darkness swallowed me whole. I opened my eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling, painted in a muted shade of beige. The harsh fluorescent lights of the airport interrogation room were gone, replaced by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. I was lying on a stiff mattress in a room that smelled faintly of bleach and stale coffee. My head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, and my chest felt incredibly heavy, as if a cinder block was resting on my ribs. As my vision cleared, I pushed myself up into a sitting position and looked around the sparse room. There was a single wooden dresser, a small television mounted to the wall, and a thick blackout curtain pulled tightly across the only window. I was in a federal safe house. The memories of the previous night rushed back into my mind with the force of a tidal wave. The revelation of the $50 million life insurance policy. The horrific plan to drug me and throw me overboard into the deep waters of the Caribbean Sea. And the video. The agonizing, beautiful, heartbreaking video of the father I had hated for 23 years, telling me that his cruelty was the only thing keeping me alive. A single tear escaped my eye and rolled down my cheek. I reached up and wiped it away. That would be the very last tear I ever shed for my family. The crushing weight of my grief was rapidly morphing into something else entirely. The sorrow evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculating, and absolute fury. They had stolen my father from me. They had stolen my childhood and my peace of mind, and they had tried to steal my life. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and planted my bare feet firmly on the cold hardwood floor. I was no longer the unwanted stray they could kick around. I was the heir to the Washington Empire, and I was a forensic accountant who knew exactly how to dismantle a financial syndicate piece by piece. The heavy metal door of the bedroom clicked open, and Agent Davis stepped inside, followed closely by Attorney Sterling. Sterling looked even older in the harsh morning light, his shoulders stooped with exhaustion. Agent Davis held a manila folder in his hands and looked at me with a mixture of professional concern and guarded caution. "You gave us quite a scare, Miss Washington, Agent," Davis said, keeping his voice low and even. The paramedics said it was a severe panic attack brought on by acute psychological shock. We brought you to this secure location while you were unconscious. You are completely safe here, and we have a team of federal marshals posted outside the building. I stood up slowly, testing my balance. My legs felt solid. My mind was sharper than it had been in years. "I do not want to be here," I said, looking directly into the eyes of the federal agent. Sterling stepped forward, gripping his wooden cane. "Zuri, please listen to us," he pleaded softly. "Beatrice and Liam are incredibly dangerous people. The syndicate they work for has eyes everywhere in Atlanta. Agent Davis and I have spent all night drafting a protective custody agreement. We want to place you in the Federal Witness Protection Program. We can give you a new identity and relocate you to a secure state until we can build a solid criminal case against your mother." I shook my head slowly. I stared at the two men who were trying to save me and felt a dark smile touch the corners of my mouth. I do not need a new identity, I replied calmly. And I am not going to hide in the shadows while the people who murdered my father continue to live in luxury. Witness protection is for people who are running away. I am not running anymore. Agent Davis frowned and crossed his arms over his chest. Miss Washington, you do not understand the magnitude of what we are dealing with. If Beatrice finds out that you are alive, and that you know about the blind trust, she will not hesitate to hire professionals to finish the job. You are a civilian. You cannot fight a money laundering cartel by yourself. I am not a civilian, Agent Davis, I said, taking a step toward him. I am a senior forensic accountant. I track missing millions for a living. I find the invisible threads that tie corrupt billionaires to their offshore accounts. Beatrice and Liam might have thugs and hitmen, but they need their money to pay them. Without their cash flow, they are nothing but desperate criminals waiting to be caught. I am not going to fight them with guns. I am going to fight them with numbers. I am going to freeze every single dollar they have and burn their fake empire to the ground. Sterling looked at me, a spark of hope igniting in his tired eyes. You sound exactly like your father. Father, he whispered. He always said you would be the one to finish the war he started. I turned to Sterling and held out my hand. Give me my phone, I demanded. And give me the access codes to the corporate financial mainframe. My father left me 60% of the voting shares and full control of the blind trust. It is time I started acting like the chairman of the board. Agent Davis hesitated, looking between me and the older lawyer. Finally, he sighed and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out my personal cell phone and handed it to me. We charged it for you, he said. You have several missed calls and text messages from the island. I took the phone and unlocked the screen. The bright interface illuminated the dark room. I opened my messages and saw exactly what I had expected to see. There was a text message from my younger sister Chloe sent just 2 hours ago. It was dripping with her usual arrogant entitlement. Where did you run off to, you pathetic lowlife? The message read. We went to your hotel room and all your things were gone. Are you trying to skip out on the hotel bill again? Mom is furious. You ruined the yacht trip. Do not bother coming back. We are having a wonderful time without your ugly face bringing down the mood. I read the words and felt absolutely nothing. The sharp sting her insults used to cause had been completely neutralized by the truth. I tapped the screen and crafted my reply, making sure to keep my tone exactly as subservient and practical as they expected from me. Work emergency. I typed, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard. One of my clients had a massive audit issue, and I had to fly back on a red-eye flight. I am so sorry I ruined the morning. Please tell Mother I apologize. Enjoy the credit cards. I hit send and tossed the phone onto the unmade bed. They thought they had won. They thought I had scurried away like a frightened mouse, entirely unaware of their plot to murder me. Let them enjoy their morning mimosas and designer shopping sprees. The higher they climbed, the harder the fall was going to be. Sterling placed his battered leather briefcase on the dresser and popped the brass latches. He pulled out a thick encrypted hard drive and a small silver security token. Your father spent his final months moving the core assets of the Washington Group into the blind trust, Sterling explained as he handed me the devices. He structured it so that the trust completely bypasses the current board of directors which Beatrice currently controls. As of midnight last night, when you officially turned 32, you became the sole absolute manager of the trust. I plugged the hard drive into the secure laptop Agent Davis provided and inserted the silver token. A black screen popped up demanding a sequence of passcodes. Sterling leaned over and recited a string of alphanumeric characters. I typed them in without hesitation. The screen went blank for a fraction of a second before exploding into a massive dashboard of financial data. I was in. I was looking at the actual beating heart of the Washington family empire. I could see the real estate holdings, the commercial development contracts, the liquid asset accounts, and the complex web of shell companies Beatrice had created to wash the cartel cash. It was a chaotic masterpiece of financial deception, but to my trained eyes, it was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. I sat down at the small desk and cracked my knuckles. It is time to fire the first shot, I said quietly. I pulled up the corporate credit accounts. Beatrice and Liam lived their entire opulent lifestyle on the back of the corporate treasury. Every designer dress, every private jet flight, every bottle of vintage champagne was charged to the company accounts. Because Beatrice controlled the board, she had given herself and Liam unlimited access to the corporate black cards. But the blind trust owned the holding company that issued those cards. And I owned the blind trust. I opened the transaction ledger and began tracking their current locations. Liam had just swiped his black card at a luxury watch boutique in Saint Barts. The transaction was pending for $120,000. He was likely buying another gaudy timepiece to celebrate my supposed disappearance. Beatrice had an open tab at an exclusive beach club nearby. I hovered my cursor over the master control switch for the executive accounts. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs. I thought about my father dragging me to the door. I thought about the $100 bill. I thought about the $50 million life insurance policy that was supposed to be the price of my life. I clicked the mouse. A green confirmation bar flashed across the top of the screen. In a matter of milliseconds, every single credit card, debit card, and corporate expense account linked to Beatrice, Chloe, and Liam was completely frozen. I did not just lower their limits. I locked the accounts entirely and flagged them for severe corporate fraud. Any attempt to swipe those cards would result in a hard decline and an automatic notification to the merchant that the cards were invalid and potentially stolen. Agent Davis looked over my shoulder and let out a low whistle. "You just cut off their oxygen supply," he noted. "They are standing in the most expensive boutiques on one of the most expensive islands in the world," I replied. My eyes locked on the live transaction feed. "And right now, they do not have a single dime to their names." I watched the screen intently, waiting for the inevitable fallout. It did not take long. 3 minutes after I initiated the freeze, a bright red notification popped up on the dashboard. It was a declined transaction from a high-end French designer boutique in Saint Barts. Beatrice had tried to charge $45,000 for a custom handbag and matching luggage set. The system rejected it immediately. 30 seconds later, another red notification appeared. She had tried a different card, declined. Then she tried a third card, declined. The alert codes indicated that the merchant terminal was instructed to confiscate the physical cards due to suspected fraud. I could picture the scene perfectly in my mind. Beatrice Washington, the undisputed queen of the Atlanta black elite, standing at the marble counter of a luxury boutique surrounded by wealthy tourists and sycophantic sales associates. I could see the initial annoyance on her perfectly contoured face when the first card was rejected. I could see that annoyance morph into deep embarrassment as the second and third cards failed. And I could see the sheer absolute panic bleeding into her eyes when the manager inevitably approached and politely informed her that all of her accounts had been flagged for fraud and her cards were being confiscated. She would try to call Liam to bail her out, but Liam was currently experiencing the exact same humiliation at the watch boutique down the street. His transaction had also been flagged and denied. They were stranded on an island playground for billionaires with no way to pay for their extravagant purchases, their lavish hotel suites, or their private yacht rentals. My phone lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed the private number belonging to my mother. I let it ring. A moment later, another call came in from Chloe. I ignored that one too. They were panicking. They were realizing that their invisible safety net had vanished into thin air. "They know something is wrong," Sterling said, pointing at the screen. "Look at the corporate travel portal." I switched tabs and opened the travel logs. Someone was frantically trying to access the corporate aviation account to book a private jet back to Atlanta. But I had frozen that account as well. They were locked out of the private skies. If they wanted to get back to the United States, they were going to have to do something they considered incredibly beneath them. They were going to have to fly commercial. I watched as a new charge attempted to process on a secondary emergency card Liam kept hidden. It was a charge for 3 first-class tickets on a commercial airline, leaving Saint Barts and heading straight for Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. I allowed that single transaction to process before freezing that card as well. I watched the flight confirmation process on the screen. The commercial airline system registered their names: Beatrice Washington, Chloe Washington, Liam Davies. They had managed to secure the last 3 seats on a commercial flight leaving the island in exactly 4 hours. The desperation they must be feeling right now was palpable even through the digital firewall I had erected between us. For women like my mother and a man like Liam, losing access to their capital was equivalent to losing their ability to breathe. Their entire identity, their power, and their status within the elite social circles of Atlanta depended heavily on their ability to spend without hesitation. Agent Davis stepped away from the wall and pulled out a secure communication device. "I will have a surveillance team waiting at the arrival gate when their flight lands," he said, speaking in a hushed, professional tone. "We can track their movements from the moment they step off the plane. We need to know where they go and who they contact first." "They are going to go straight to my apartment," I said, making a calculated prediction based on years of observing their toxic behavior. "They believe I am just a naive accountant who flew home early for a work emergency. They will assume that the corporate financial glitch is something I can fix for them because I have access to the lower-level accounting systems. They will want me to reverse the freeze and take the blame for the embarrassment they suffered today." Sterling frowned, adjusting his grip on his wooden cane. "Zuri, it is too dangerous for you to be there when they arrive. Liam is highly volatile, and Beatrice is completely unhinged when she feels cornered. If they show up at your apartment and realize that you are the one who orchestrated this financial blockade, they might resort to physical violence. We should keep you here in the safe house until we are ready to make the arrests." I shook my head firmly, rejecting the notion of hiding. "No, Sterling," I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the small room. "If I hide, they will know that the entire operation has been compromised. They will start destroying evidence and shredding documents before Agent Davis and his team can secure the warrants. I need to face them. I need them to believe that they still have the upper hand. I am going to let them storm into my apartment and make their demands. I will let Liam try to intimidate me. I will let my mother try to crush me with her words. It will be the perfect opportunity to draw them deeper into the trap." "You are playing a very dangerous game, Miss Washington," Agent Davis warned. "The syndicate they work for does not tolerate failure, and Beatrice knows that her time is running out." "I am aware of the risks," I said, turning my attention back to the glowing laptop screen. But they have underestimated me for my entire life. They think I am weak because I never fought back against their cruelty. They have no idea what 23 years of calculated patience looks like." I began typing a new sequence of commands into the financial mainframe, preparing the next phase of my digital assault. I was going to strip away every layer of their false empire until there was absolutely nothing left. "Let them fly back to Atlanta," I whispered into the quiet room, watching the green cursor blink rhythmically on the monitor. "The real war has just begun." I left the federal safe house shortly after dawn. Agent Davis and Attorney Sterling offered to send a detail of federal marshals to monitor my building, but I firmly declined. I needed Beatrice and Liam to believe they were walking into a room with a frightened, isolated woman who had no idea about their murderous plots. I took a secure rideshare back to my modest apartment in Midtown Atlanta. It was a simple, functional space filled with financial textbooks and multiple computer monitors. It was nothing like the sprawling historic mansions my family occupied in the wealthy enclaves of the city. I had chosen this quiet life deliberately. I wanted nothing to tie me to their bloody money. I spent the morning preparing my digital defenses. I set up hidden recording software on my desktop computer to capture every word they were about to say. I placed my secure laptop on the kitchen island, leaving the screen open to a dummy spreadsheet, so I would look exactly like the overworked accountant they believed me to be. I tracked their commercial flight on my secondary monitor. The flight from Saint Barts landed at Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta International Airport at exactly 2 in the afternoon. I knew it would take them at least an hour to navigate the commercial baggage claim and find transportation since their black car service had been completely frozen. I made myself a cup of black coffee and sat on a stool by the kitchen island, waiting with absolute stillness. My heart did not race. My hands did not tremble. The revelation of my father's sacrifice had burned away all the fear I had ever carried. I was no longer the discarded daughter seeking approval. I was the architect of their impending destruction. At exactly 3:45 in the afternoon, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside my apartment. They did not bother knocking. A loud crash reverberated through the small space as Liam kicked the heavy wooden door open with his expensive leather shoe. The door swung inward violently, slamming against the drywall and leaving a deep dent. Liam stormed into my living room, his face flushed with a dark, furious red. He looked nothing like the polished elite hedge fund manager who had mocked me at the Michelin-starred restaurant just a day ago. His custom-tailored suit was deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat from sitting in a cramped commercial airline seat for hours. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. Mother, Beatrice, followed close behind him, pushing her way through the doorway with an expression of pure venom. Her usual immaculate facade was completely shattered. Her expensive silk blouse was rumpled, and her hair had lost its perfect styling in the humid Atlanta air. She darted her eyes around my modest living room with absolute disgust, as if simply breathing the air in my apartment was a profound insult to her social standing. Chloe trailed in last, dragging her feet and complaining loudly about the humidity and how much her feet hurt from walking through the crowded commercial terminal. She looked at my small kitchen and rolled her eyes, making a dramatic show of refusing to touch anything in the room. Liam marched directly toward me, closing the distance until he was standing just inches from where I sat at the kitchen island. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a dark blue cover. He raised his arm and slammed the heavy portfolio down onto the granite countertop with enough force to make my coffee mug rattle. "You ruined the family trip," he snarled, leaning over the counter to intimidate me. His breath smelled of stale coffee and pure anxiety. "You had a temper tantrum and ran away because you were too cheap to pay for dinner, and because of your little stunt, our corporate accounts experienced a massive security glitch. Our cards were frozen and we were completely humiliated in front of our peers. We had to fly commercial like a bunch of common tourists." Beatrice stepped up beside him, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. Zuri." She spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "I extended an olive branch to you. I brought you to Saint Barts to heal our relationship, and you repay my kindness by throwing a childish fit and abandoning us. You owe Liam a massive apology for ruining his vacation. And more importantly, you owe this family a debt for your pathetic behavior." I sat perfectly still, looking at the three of them. It was almost comical how easily they fell back into their old patterns of manipulation. They were trying to gaslight me into believing that the massive financial freeze I had orchestrated was just a random corporate glitch caused by my sudden departure. They wanted me feeling guilty and subservient so they could spring their next trap. Chloe stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You should be grateful Liam is even giving you a chance to help this family after what you did," she sneered. "You always ruin everything, Zuri. You are just lucky Liam is generous enough to let you make up for it." I slowly looked down at the dark blue portfolio Liam had slammed onto the counter. The title on the cover read, "Risk Insurance Guarantor Agreement." I did not touch it right away. I let the silence stretch in the room, watching the nervous energy radiate from Liam's rigid posture. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and confused, playing the role they expected. "It is a standard corporate guarantor document," Liam said, speaking quickly and dismissively. "Because of the security glitch. With the holding company accounts, my hedge fund is experiencing a temporary liquidity hold. I need a family member with a clean financial record to sign as a secondary guarantor to release the funds. It is just a formality. You will not actually have to pay anything. Just sign the last page and provide your social security number and thumbprint so my wealth managers can process the release." I looked at the document again. It was a brilliant and desperate pivot, since they had failed to murder me and claim the $50 million life insurance policy in Saint Barts. Liam was trying a different route to save his collapsing hedge fund. He wanted me to sign a legal document that would make me personally liable for his massive financial deficit. If I signed this paper, he could transfer all of his toxic debt directly into my name. When his hedge fund inevitably imploded, the federal government would look at the guarantor agreement and hold me completely responsible for the missing millions. I would go to federal prison for the rest of my life, and Liam would walk away entirely free. I reached out and slowly pulled the portfolio toward me. I flipped open the heavy cover and began reading the dense legal jargon on the first page. Liam tapped his fingers impatiently on the granite counter, telling me to just skip to the signature page at the back. I ignored him and continued reading, turning the pages with deliberate slowness. As a senior forensic accountant, reading complex financial contracts was my native language. I did not just read the words, I saw the mathematical architecture hidden beneath them. I saw the routing numbers for the offshore shell companies Beatrice used to wash the cartel money. I saw the hidden clauses that waived all rights to a legal defense. I saw the exact mechanisms Liam was using to drain capital from his own investors. You do not need to read the whole thing. Liam snapped, his voice rising in panic. I just told you it is a simple formality. Just sign the paper, Zuri. We do not have all day. I reached the fourth page of the document and stopped. I traced my finger over a specific paragraph detailing the transfer of liability for a series of high-risk derivatives. I looked up at Liam and let the mask of the frightened sister fall completely away. I met his eyes with a stare so cold and piercing that he actually took a half-step back. I am not signing this, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Beatrice slammed her hand on the counter. Do not be difficult, Zuri, she yelled. You owe us this. Sign the document right now. I picked up the entire portfolio and held it in the air between us. I am not signing this, I repeated slowly and clearly, because this is not a simple formality. This is a fraudulent transfer of debt. Just glancing at page 4, I can already spot 3 glaring federal securities violations. Clause 7 attempts to bypass the mandatory disclosure regulations outlined in the Dodd-Frank Act. Clause 12 illegally attempts to shift primary liability for unverified derivatives onto an uninformed third party. And the routing structure listed in Appendix B is a textbook violation of international anti-money laundering protocols. The color completely drained from Liam's face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Chloe looked confused, staring back and forth between me and her husband. Beatrice stood absolutely frozen, her eyes wide with sudden terror. They had expected a naive, compliant accountant. They had no idea they were standing in front of a financial predator. Did you really think you could use me as the fall guy for the $20 million deficit in your hedge fund? Liam, I asked, my voice echoing in the quiet apartment. Did you really think I would blindly sign away my freedom just because you yelled at me? A freshman finance student could spot the toxic debt hidden in this trap. You stole $20 million from your investors to buy luxury cars and private yachts, and now that the cartel wants their money back, you are trying to serve me up on a silver platter to take the fall. Liam's hands began to shake violently. The veins in his neck bulged against his skin. How do you know about the deficit? He whispered, his voice cracking with pure panic. How do you know about that number? Because I know everything, I replied, placing the portfolio back on the counter. I know about the missing 20 million. I know about the offshore shadow accounts in the Cayman Islands. And I know about the $50 million life insurance policy you and Beatrice took out on my life 3 weeks ago. The silence in the room became absolute. The air grew incredibly thick and suffocating. The realization that their entire murderous plot had been uncovered hit them with the force of a physical blow. Beatrice clutched her chest, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her silk blouse. Chloe finally understood the gravity of the situation and backed away toward the front door, her eyes wide with terror. Liam lost his mind. The cornered, arrogant executive snapped. He let out a guttural roar of pure rage and lunged forward across the kitchen island, reaching out to grab my throat. His large hands clawed at the air, aiming directly for my neck. I did not flinch. I did not move backward. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone, aiming the glowing screen directly at his face. Take one more step, I said, my voice slicing through his rage like a razor blade, and this complete audit report goes straight to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Liam stopped dead in his tracks, his hands hovering just inches from my face. He stared at the screen of my phone. I had an email drafted and ready to send, addressed directly to the Enforcement Division of the SEC. Attached to the email was a comprehensive audit of his hedge fund, detailing every stolen dollar and every fraudulent wire transfer he had ever authorized. "If you touch me, I press send," I told him, keeping my eyes locked on his. "If you try to take this phone from me, I press send. If you do anything other than back away from this counter slowly and carefully, the federal government will have enough evidence to put you in federal prison for the rest of your natural life." Liam slowly lowered his hands. He stepped back from the island, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with a desperate trapped panic. He knew I had him completely beaten. He knew that his entire life of luxury and privilege was currently resting on the tip of my thumb. Beatrice stepped in front of him, her face contorted into a mask of pure demonic hatred. The polite society mother vanished, completely revealing the ruthless cartel money launderer hiding beneath the designer clothes. She stared at me with an intensity that would have terrified me when I was 9 years old, but today it only fueled my fire. "You think you are so smart?" Beatrice hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think you can threaten us in our own city? You have no idea who you are dealing with, Zuri. I built this family empire, and I control the elite circles of Atlanta. You are nothing but a discarded mistake. I will use every connection I have to utterly destroy your career. I will make sure you never work in finance again. I will make sure you are blacklisted from every firm in this state, and I will personally see to it that you are ruined." I smiled at her, a cold, calculating smile that mirrored the one she had given me at the restaurant in Saint Barts. "I look forward to watching you try, Mother," I replied quietly. Beatrice grabbed the blue portfolio off the counter and shoved Liam toward the door. Chloe scrambled out into the hallway first, desperate to escape the tension in the room. Beatrice turned back to look at me one last time, her eyes promising absolute destruction, before she slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind her. I stood alone in my apartment, listening to their footsteps fade down the hallway. The apartment was silent again, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. They had come here to manipulate and destroy me, but they had left completely exposed and terrified. I picked up my phone and deleted the draft email to the SEC. I was not going to send it yet. Turning Liam over to the federal authorities right now would be too easy and too quick. I wanted to dismantle them slowly. I wanted them to watch their power, their wealth, and their social standing crumble into dust, piece by piece. I walked over to the large window in my living room and looked out over the sprawling skyline of Atlanta. The city belonged to the elite, but they were about to learn that the elite belonged to me. I had just fired the opening shot of the war, and the next phase of my plan was already in motion. Beatrice thought she could destroy my life in Atlanta. She had no idea that she was standing on a financial landmine, and I held the detonator firmly in my hand. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hardwood floor of my apartment. I had stayed awake all night, monitoring the financial feeds on my secure laptop. My phone buzzed on the kitchen island. It was exactly 8 in the morning. A loud, aggressive knock echoed through the small hallway. I stood up and walked to the front door, opening it slowly. Mr. Henderson, my landlord, stood there looking incredibly uncomfortable. I was a middle-aged man who usually greeted me with a warm smile, but today he could not even meet my eyes. He held a piece of paper in his trembling hands. "I am so sorry, Zuri," he mumbled, shoving the paper toward my chest. "You have to leave. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises." I did not react to his nervous energy. I took the paper and scanned the bold text. It was a formal eviction notice citing a vague breach of contract clause. I looked back at Mr. Henderson. "My rent is paid 6 months in advance," I stated calmly. "There is no legal ground for this eviction." He swallowed hard and took a step back. "I know," he whispered, looking over his shoulder as if someone was watching him. "But your mother called the property management company late last night. She spoke directly to the regional director. She told them you were involved in illegal financial activities and that federal agents would be raiding the building soon. She threatened to pull all of the Washington Group real estate investments from our firm if we did not kick you out immediately. I have orders from the very top, Zuri. If I do not evict you, I lose my job and my pension. Please do not make this harder than it has to be." I nodded slowly, understanding exactly what was happening. Beatrice was mobilizing her social and corporate power. She was using her status as the queen of the Atlanta black elite to crush me into submission. She thought making me homeless would break my spirit. She thought taking away my safe haven would force me to come crawling back to her begging for mercy. "You do not need to worry, Mr. Henderson," I told him, keeping my voice steady. "I will be out by noon." He let out a massive sigh of relief and scurried away down the hall. I closed the door and turned back to my apartment. I felt no attachment to this place. It was just four walls and a roof. I grabbed my single suitcase and began packing my few personal belongings. As I folded my clothes, my cell phone began to ring incessantly. I let it go to voicemail, knowing exactly what was coming next. The notifications popped up on my screen one after another. They were emails from my private consulting clients. I had spent 5 years building a roster of highly respectable mid-level financial firms in Georgia who relied on my forensic audits to keep their ledgers clean. Now they were all terminating my contracts simultaneously. I opened the first email from a wealth management firm downtown. The message was brief and cold, stating that their board of directors had voted to sever all ties with my agency, effective immediately. The second email from a boutique investment bank cited concerns about my professional integrity. The third email was from a senior partner who had been my mentor. His message was much more revealing. "Zuri," he wrote, "I do not know what you did to anger your mother, but Beatrice Washington just sent a mass communication to the entire Atlanta Commerce Club. She claimed you embezzled funds from her charity accounts and that you are currently under investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She told everyone that associating with you would bring federal scrutiny to their own doors. I am so sorry, but I have to protect my partners. Do not contact me again." I locked my phone and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. Beatrice was executing a scorched earth campaign. She was burning every bridge I had ever built, trying to isolate me completely. She wanted me poor, homeless, and unemployable. 10 minutes later, a text message arrived from an unknown number. I knew immediately it was Beatrice using a burner phone since I had blocked her primary number. "This is what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you," the message read. "You are nothing in this city without my blessing. You have no home and no career. You are right back where you started at 9 years old. When you are ready to sign the guarantor documents for Liam, come to the main estate. Otherwise, enjoy sleeping on the streets." I smiled at the glowing screen. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had stripped me of my power because she thought my power was tied to this tiny apartment and a handful of local clients. She had no idea that I held the keys to a kingdom she could not even comprehend. I opened my encrypted laptop and accessed the blind trust accounts. My father had left me $150 million in liquid, untraceable assets. I navigated to the booking portal for the Waldorf Astoria in Buckhead. It was the most exclusive hotel in the city, a place where Beatrice frequently hosted her high society luncheons. I selected the presidential suite, the massive penthouse that occupied the entire top floor. I booked it for the next 6 months and paid the exorbitant fee in full, using a secondary corporate routing number that Beatrice could not trace. I wanted to surround myself with the exact same opulent luxury that my family believed they held a monopoly on. I zipped my suitcase shut and picked up my laptop bag. I walked out of the modest apartment without a single backward glance. The walls that had confined me for so many years were no longer my prison. I was stepping out of the shadows and stepping directly into the blinding light of my new reality. I was done playing small. It was time to start operating on their level and beat them at their own ruthless game. The presidential suite at the Waldorf Astoria was a sprawling masterpiece of modern luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. The floors were polished marble, and the living area featured a grand piano and custom leather furniture. I set my secure laptop on the massive glass dining table and connected my secondary monitors, creating a high-tech command center high above the city streets. I sat back and watched the loading bar complete the digital transfer. I poured myself a cup of black coffee from the sterling silver carafe on the table. Beatrice wanted to play a game of real estate and eviction. I was more than happy to oblige her. I logged deep into the Washington Group corporate mainframe. I bypassed the standard accounting software and accessed the hidden holding companies that Beatrice and Liam managed. I was looking for a very specific property. My younger sister Chloe lived in a massive multi-million-dollar mansion in the affluent neighborhood of Buckhead, just a few miles away from my current location. Chloe constantly bragged about the estate on social media, flaunting her sweeping marble staircases and her custom-heated swimming pool. She claimed Liam had bought it for her as a lavish wedding gift to prove his immense wealth and devotion to her. I knew better. Liam did not have the personal capital to buy a $10 million estate outright. I began tracing the property deed through the digital archives. It took me 2 hours to peel back the layers of shell companies and offshore trusts they had used to hide the transaction. The money trail wound through 3 different countries before finally landing back in Atlanta. Finally, I hit the bedrock. The deed to Chloe and Liam's mansion was not in their names at all. Beatrice had illegally used funds from the primary family trust to purchase the property, assigning the deed to a shadow corporation called Apex Holdings. She had essentially stolen money from the corporate treasury to buy a house for her golden child, hiding the massive theft behind layers of corporate jargon and fake board approvals. But Apex Holdings was a direct subsidiary of the Washington Group. And the blind trust my father had established legally owned every single subsidiary of the Washington Group, which meant that I owned Apex Holdings. And by extension, I owned Chloe and Liam's house. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I drafted a series of immediate legal transfers. Using my authority as the sole manager and chairman of the blind trust, I initiated a complete corporate restructuring of Apex Holdings. I transferred the property deed directly into my own personal name, dissolving the shadow corporation entirely. The municipal databases registered the transfer within minutes. The massive Buckhead estate was now legally and indisputably my personal property. I opened a new document and began drafting a formal eviction notice. I made sure the legal language was absolutely flawless. I stated that the current occupants, Chloe Washington and Liam Davies, were residing in the property illegally without a valid lease agreement from the rightful owner. I gave them exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises or face immediate physical removal by the Fulton County Sheriff and local law enforcement. I sent the eviction notice directly to a premium courier service, instructing them to hand-deliver the document to Chloe and Liam at exactly dinner time. I wanted to ruin their evening. I wanted them to feel the exact same sheer panic that my landlord had felt this morning. Beatrice thought she could make me homeless with a single phone call. I was going to throw her precious golden child out onto the street, and there was not a single thing her high society friends could do to stop it. With the eviction notice sent and processing, I turned my attention to my mother's most prized possession. Beatrice did not just value cold hard money. She valued optics and prestige above all else. She survived on the adoration and deep envy of her wealthy peers. Her entire social standing was anchored by her annual charity gala. It was the most exclusive black tie event in Atlanta, drawing influential politicians, celebrities, and the absolute upper echelon of the black elite. The gala was scheduled to take place in exactly 3 days at the historic Biltmore Estate. Beatrice has spent the entire year planning this single night to showcase her absolute dominance over the city. She used the gala to secure wealthy investors for Liam and to parade Chloe around in front of the flashbulbs of the local media. It was the source of all her social power and the foundation of her public identity. I dove into the financial records for the upcoming gala. Beatrice claimed in all her press releases that she personally funded the massive event out of the goodness of her own heart. The truth hidden deep in the corporate ledgers was that she used the Washington Group philanthropic arm to pay for absolutely everything. The lavish venue, the gourmet catering, the private security details, the expensive imported floral arrangements, everything was paid for by the corporate charity fund. I accessed the bank accounts for the philanthropic arm. As the legitimate chairman of the Blind Trust, I had absolute veto power over all charitable expenditures. I initiated a complete freeze on the accounts holding the gala funds. I canceled every pending wire transfer to the event planners, the caterers, and the entertainment vendors. The money simply vanished from their pending ledgers. Then I went straight for the jugular. I accessed the municipal contract for the Biltmore Estate venue. The contract specifically stipulated that the venue rental must be paid in full and authorized by a certified corporate officer of the sponsoring organization. Beatrice had signed the contract as the managing director of the Washington Group. I drafted a strict legal injunction and sent it directly to the City Hall Events Management Department. I provided indisputable proof that Beatrice Washington had been formally removed from the board of directors and no longer had the legal authority to authorize corporate funds or sign contracts on behalf of the Washington Group. I sat back in my plush leather chair and looked out over the glittering lights of the city spreading out below my penthouse window. My coffee was cold, but the fire in my chest was burning hotter than ever. Across town in her sprawling mansion, Beatrice was likely sitting in her opulent home office, sipping an expensive glass of wine, believing she had successfully destroyed my life and secured her empire. Then her private fax machine began to print an urgent document. It was an official letter from City Hall. The bold letters at the top stated that the venue for her prestigious annual charity gala had been officially seized, and the entire event was completely canceled due to fraudulent corporate signatures and a lack of authorized funding. The letter stated clearly that the only way the severe cancellation could be reversed was if the new board chairman signed a fresh authorization and appeared in person to validate the corporate funds. Beatrice would stare at that letter, her expensive wine glass slipping from her manicured fingers and shattering on the hardwood floor. She would frantically call her elite lawyers demanding to know who this mysterious new chairman was and how they had usurped her power. She had absolutely no idea that the chairman holding the keys to her entire social existence was the very daughter she had just tried to leave homeless on the streets. Let her panic. Let her scramble in the dark, searching for answers she could not find. The main event was just beginning, and I held every single card. I sat in the plush leather chair of the presidential suite, watching the city lights flicker through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My laptop screen glowed with the confirmation message from City Hall. I let her sweat for exactly 24 hours. I let her experience the agonizing terror of losing her absolute most important social event of the year. Then early this morning, I logged into the secure municipal portal and digitally signed the authorization releasing the venue and the corporate funds. I did not do it out of mercy. I did it because I needed a stage for the final act. I needed Beatrice and Liam to gather every single wealthy investor and influential socialite in Atlanta into one room. I needed a spectacular audience to witness their ultimate destruction. Shortly after I authorized the funds, a heavily embossed envelope arrived at the concierge desk of the Waldorf Astoria. It had been forwarded from my old apartment complex. I opened the thick cream-colored paper and pulled out a gold letter-pressed invitation to the charity gala. But it was not a guest invitation. Beatrice had included a typed note on her personal stationery. The message was dripping with her usual toxic condescension. It stated that she knew I was currently homeless and unemployed after my supposed illegal financial activities. She wrote that she was willing to offer me a one-night job working as a server at the gala. She demanded that I show up at the service entrance wearing a plain black uniform so I could pass out champagne to her wealthy guests. She actually wrote that it would be a good opportunity for me to learn humility and observe how successful people operate in polite society. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to parade me in front of the black elite of Atlanta as her broken, discarded daughter to prove her ultimate dominance over my life. I read the letter twice and let out a soft laugh that echoed in the empty penthouse. Beatrice was handing me the perfect opportunity on a silver platter. She expected a defeated server to walk through the back alley service doors. I was going to walk through the main double doors and take my rightful place as the queen of the Washington Empire. I spent the next 2 days preparing for the gala with absolute precision. Attorney Sterling visited my suite bringing a heavy steel lockbox that had been kept in a high-security vault for 23 years. Inside the lockbox was the ultimate symbol of my father's legacy. It was the Panther's Eye diamond necklace. The necklace was a breathtaking piece of bespoke jewelry featuring a massive, flawless black diamond surrounded by dozens of cascading white diamonds set in platinum. It had belonged to my paternal great-grandmother and was the most famous and coveted heirloom in the Washington family. Beatrice had spent the last 2 decades obsessively tearing the family estate apart trying to find it. She had hired private investigators and drilled into hidden wall safes, convinced my father had hidden it from her before he died. She wanted to wear it to her galas, to cement her status as the untouchable matriarch. She never knew that my father had given it to Sterling with strict instructions to hand it over to me when I took control of the blind trust. Holding the heavy platinum chain in my hands, I felt a profound connection to the father who had sacrificed everything to protect me. Wearing this necklace tonight would not just be a fashion statement, it would be a declaration of war. It would be the ultimate visual proof that Beatrice had lost the empire. I hired a private styling team to come to the penthouse. They brought racks of custom couture gowns straight from the runways of Paris and Milan. I bypassed the safe muted colors and chose a striking crimson-red gown that swept the floor with dramatic elegance. The dress featured a deep plunging neckline that was specifically designed to highlight a piece of statement jewelry. The crimson silk gathered at my waist and flowed into a long, sweeping train that demanded attention with every step. My stylist pulled my hair back into a sleek, elegant updo that exposed my neck and shoulders when they finally fastened the panther's eye diamond necklace around my throat. The transformation was absolute. The massive black diamond rested perfectly against my collarbone, absorbing the light and radiating pure authority. I looked in the floor-to-ceiling mirror and saw a woman who possessed the power to crush a financial syndicate with a single keystroke. I looked like the chairman of the board. I looked like a woman who owned the city. The historic Biltmore estate was glowing with brilliant spotlights when my hired driver pulled up to the front entrance. A massive red carpet stretched from the street to the grand double doors. Dozens of valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open car doors for the steady stream of politicians, celebrities, and corporate executives arriving for the event. The local media had set up a press gauntlet behind velvet ropes, snapping photographs and shouting questions at the elite guests. This was the pinnacle of Atlanta high society, and Beatrice had meticulously engineered every single detail to reflect her own glory. I instructed my driver to circle the block twice. I wanted to ensure that Beatrice, Chloe, and Liam were already inside holding court in the main ballroom before I made my entrance. I wanted maximum visibility. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was electric with the hum of wealth and false pleasantries. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the sea of custom tuxedos and designer gowns. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and expensive caviar. At the far end of the room, Beatrice stood on a slightly elevated landing, acting as the supreme hostess. She wore an icy silver gown that glittered with sequins, and she smiled graciously as wealthy donors lined up to kiss her cheek. Liam stood nearby looking incredibly tense, but doing his best to play the role of the successful hedge fund manager. He clutched a glass of whiskey tightly, trying to project confidence to his wealthy clients, despite knowing his financial world was currently locked in a deep freeze. Chloe hovered next to her husband, wearing an ostentatious emerald green dress that looked far too tight. She was loudly boasting to a group of socialites about an upcoming trip to Europe, trying to overcompensate for the severe panic she had felt in my apartment just days prior. They were all putting on the performance of a lifetime, completely unaware that the curtain was about to drop permanently. I stepped out of my vehicle and walked slowly up the red carpet. The media photographers instantly turned their lenses toward me. The flashes of their cameras strobed like lightning in the night air. They did not immediately recognize me because I had spent my life intentionally staying out of the societal spotlight, but they recognized the sheer power and wealth radiating from my appearance. They recognized the custom couture gown, and they definitely recognized the massive legendary diamond resting against my throat. Whispers began to ripple through the press line as reporters scrambled to identify the stunning woman in crimson red. I ignored their shouted questions and walked with measured, deliberate steps toward the grand entrance. The heavy oak doors were pulled open by two doormen who bowed slightly as I passed. I stepped into the foyer and handed my coat to a stunned attendant. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. It was time. I walked through the arched entryway and stepped into the grand ballroom. My crimson gown stood out like a brilliant flame against the sea of muted formal wear. As I moved forward, the crowd of wealthy guests naturally began to part, creating a wide path for me to walk through. The low hum of conversation slowly died down, replacing itself with a wave of hushed whispers and sharp intakes of breath. People were staring at the panther's eye diamond. It was a mythical piece of jewelry in this city, and its sudden appearance on the neck of an unrecognized woman sent shockwaves through the room. I walked with absolute purpose, my eyes locked on the elevated landing at the far end of the ballroom. I did not look at the guests. I looked straight at the woman who had tried to murder me for $50 million. Beatrice was in the middle of laughing at a joke told by a local politician when she noticed the sudden shift in the room's energy. She turned her head, following the gaze of the crowd. When her eyes landed on me, her polite smile instantly froze. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly pale gray. Her eyes went wide with a mixture of absolute disbelief and sheer terror. She recognized me immediately, but her brain could not process what she was seeing. She had expected a broken homeless daughter to slink through the service doors in a cheap black uniform. Instead, she was looking at a woman who radiated more wealth and power than anyone else in the room. Then her eyes dropped to my neck. She saw the panther's eye diamond, the heirloom she had relentlessly hunted for 23 years, the physical symbol of the Washington Empire. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She looked like she had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave. Chloe noticed her mother's paralysis and turned to see what was happening. Her reaction was far less restrained. Chloe took one look at me in my custom crimson gown and let out a loud, dramatic gasp. Her eyes darted from my face to the massive black diamond resting on my collarbone. Greed and furious entitlement immediately overtook any sense of public decorum she possessed. She had grown up believing that everything of value in the Washington family belonged exclusively to her. She thought she was the golden child who deserved every jewel and every dollar. Seeing me wearing the ultimate family treasure broke her fragile mind. Chloe let out a high-pitched screech that echoed clearly across the quiet ballroom. She shoved her way past a group of startled investors and stomped directly toward me, her face contorted in an ugly mask of rage. She did not care that hundreds of the most influential people in Atlanta were watching her every move. She only cared about taking what she believed was hers. She closed the distance between us in seconds. "You thief!" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Give that back to me right now, you pathetic thief!" She lunged forward, reaching out with both hands to physically rip the diamond necklace off my throat. She expected me to cower. She expected me to shrink back and submit to her demands, just like I had done when we were children. She expected me to be the weak sister who always backed down to avoid a confrontation. But I was not that sister anymore. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. As her hands darted toward my neck, I raised my right arm with lightning speed. I swatted her hands away with a sharp, forceful strike. The loud smack of my hand hitting hers echoed through the silent ballroom. Chloe stumbled backward, clutching her wrist in absolute shock. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely unaccustomed to anyone fighting back against her physical aggression. I stepped closer to her, my posture towering over her shrinking frame. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for my response. I kept my voice perfectly level, but I projected it loudly enough so that every single guest, every investor, and every socialite in the room could hear exactly what I was saying. "Thief," I asked, my voice dripping with cold, analytical authority. "You are calling me a thief, Chloe. This necklace was left in a highly secured safety deposit box exclusively for the legitimate chairman of the Washington Corporation. It belongs to me legally and entirely." I took another step forward, forcing her to retreat further. "As for you, Chloe," I continued, pointing a single manicured finger at her chest, "the incredibly ugly emerald green dress you are currently wearing was purchased 3 days ago using a corporate credit card. A corporate credit card that I personally froze and flagged for severe financial fraud. You are standing in a room full of respectable business people wearing stolen corporate property. So tell me, Chloe, which one of us is the actual thief?" The collective gasp from the surrounding crowd was audible. Wealthy investors and socialites began whispering frantically to one another, covering their mouths in shock. In the elite circles of Atlanta, financial fraud was the ultimate cardinal sin. Accusing someone of wearing stolen goods bought with fraudulent corporate funds was a social execution. Chloe stood frozen, her face burning with a deep, humiliating red. She looked down at her green dress as if it had suddenly caught fire. She tried to formulate a response to defend herself, but her mind was completely blank. She looked back at Liam, silently begging her husband to intervene and save her from this public slaughter. Liam pushed his way through the massive crowd of the Atlanta elite, his face dark with sheer fury as he realized his carefully constructed facade was crumbling into dust right before his eyes. He pointed an aggressive, shaking finger at my face, his chest heaving with desperate, unhinged panic. He turned toward the uniformed private guards stationed near the arched entrances of the grand ballroom and began shouting frantic, chaotic orders. "Grab her!" he yelled, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Drag this crazy lunatic out of here right now because she is a dangerous con artist and a thief." He frantically tried to rally the surrounding crowd of wealthy donors, claiming I was a mentally unstable stranger who had somehow sneaked past the heavy velvet ropes and strict security checkpoints to disrupt his mother-in-law's prestigious charity event. I did not move a single muscle or show any sign of fear as the private security guards took a tentative step forward. I simply looked past Liam's shaking finger and scanned the dark perimeter of the opulent grand ballroom. My eyes finally found Attorney Sterling, standing quietly and discreetly near the audio-visual control booth at the back. Sterling was watching me with a look of intense anticipation, waiting for my command. I gave him a single deliberate nod of my head. Sterling immediately raised his hand and signaled the technical operators he had generously paid off earlier in the evening. The massive high-definition screens surrounding the entire ballroom had been displaying the elegant scrolling logo of my mother's fake philanthropic foundation. Suddenly, all the screens flickered violently and went entirely black. A low, nervous murmur of deep confusion rippled through the hundreds of wealthy investors and elite socialites who had gathered for the gala. A split second later, the giant screens illuminated with a blinding white light, displaying a series of highly classified internal financial dashboards and complex audit reports. I walked directly to the main presentation podium, situated on the elevated marble landing. The highly paid, hired master of ceremonies stepped away in absolute shock as I confidently took the microphone from the tall metal stand. I turned to face the vast sea of the Atlanta elite, my custom crimson silk gown glowing brilliantly under the harsh stage lights. The heavy black diamond rested against my collarbone, anchoring my undeniable authority. I looked down at the very people who had blindly funded my mother's criminal syndicate for over 2 decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal power that echoed clearly from every massive speaker in the vaulted room. "Please direct your complete attention to the bright screens currently displaying above you. You are looking at the actual unedited cash flow ledgers and hidden transactional histories of the prestigious hedge fund currently managed by Liam Davies." I paused for a moment, letting the wealthy and powerful guests squint at the complex financial routing numbers. They stared at the massive offshore account balances, displaying in bright warning red font across the massive monitors. For the past 3 years, Liam has stood confidently in opulent rooms, exactly like this one, promising you unprecedented guaranteed returns on your hard-earned investments. I continued, my cold gaze locking entirely onto Liam. He was now sweating profusely, his face completely drained of all color as he stared at the digital proof of his massive crimes. But the financial charts glowing behind me show the undeniable absolute truth about where your money has actually been going all this time. Your millions of dollars never made it to the legitimate stock market or any verified real estate portfolios. He has been systematically and intentionally siphoning your capital through illegal shadow shell companies located in the Cayman Islands just to cover a massive $20 million deficit he created. He stole your life savings and your retirement funds to buy luxury mega yachts, custom imported sports cars, and to quietly fund the lavish penthouse apartments of his multiple secret mistresses hidden across the city. The grand ballroom instantly erupted into pure, absolute, uncontrolled chaos and deafening shouts of anger. Billionaires and powerful corporate executives began shouting in profound outrage, pulling out their expensive cell phones to frantically check their vulnerable investment portfolios. Politicians who had warmly endorsed Liam just minutes ago backed away from him quickly, as if he were carrying a deadly infectious disease. The elite high society that Beatrice had so carefully and ruthlessly cultivated over 2 decades was tearing itself apart in real time right before her terrified eyes. Women in incredibly expensive designer gowns gasped in pure horror at the public mention of Liam's hidden mistresses, casting disgusted, mocking looks directly at Chloe. Chloe stood absolutely frozen in her stolen emerald green dress, unable to comprehend the massive social execution happening to her. Liam was completely terrified to his very core. The arrogant, wealthy hedge fund manager realized that he was not just facing immediate, permanent social ruin, but decades of hard time in federal prison for massive financial fraud and grand larceny. His cowardly, desperate survival instincts kicked in immediately, and he rapidly turned on the only person standing next to him. He spun around violently and grabbed Chloe by her bare shoulders, shaking her aggressively in front of the crowd. "This is your fault!" he screamed, absolute spit flying from his mouth as he completely lost his mind in front of the investors. "You forced me to do it, Chloe. Your insatiable, greedy demand for multi-million-dollar mansions and massive, flawless diamonds and private jet vacations drained absolutely everything I had in my accounts. You told me to take the money from the fund, or you would divorce me and leave me for someone much richer." Chloe shrieked hysterically, slapping his heavy hands away from her shoulders with brutal, frantic force. Her perfectly constructed fake reality was disintegrating. "Do not you dare try to blame this massive failure on me. You pathetic, weak loser," she yelled back, tears of profound, burning humiliation streaming down her heavily contoured face. "You told me you were an absolute financial genius who knew how to beat the market. You told me we were richer and better than everyone else in this entire room. You lied to me just to get into my powerful, wealthy family, and now you are trying to drag me down into the mud in the prison cell with you." The sight of the beloved golden child fighting and her supposedly elite genius husband viciously attacking each other like wild animals in the middle of a high society charity gala was a spectacular disaster that no one could look away from. They were screaming vicious, vulgar obscenities at each other, utterly destroying whatever tiny shred of public dignity they had left in front of the entire Atlanta social registry. But Mother Beatrice was not done fighting her losing battle. The ruthless matriarch of the broken family realized that her entire social existence and her criminal empire was evaporating into thin air right in front of her. She charged toward the elevated landing, her icy, silver-sequined gown rustling aggressively as she desperately tried to salvage her crumbling legacy. Beatrice stormed heavily up the marble steps of the stage, reaching out with clawed, desperate hands to snatch the microphone directly from my firm grasp. "Turn those screens off immediately," she commanded the audio-visual technicians, her voice raw and bleeding with unhinged sheer panic. She glared at me, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate fury that showed the entire room, her true, terrifying colors. "You are a psychotic, jealous liar, Zuri," she hissed violently, attempting to pry the heavy microphone from my hands. She continued to spew her toxic lies. "You forged those digital documents because you are insanely jealous of your beautiful sister and her highly successful, wealthy husband. You have always been a sick, delusional, problematic child, and I will absolutely not let you ruin my prestigious charity event with your malicious, vindictive fabrications and your fake audit reports." I easily sidestepped her frantic, clumsy attempt to grab the microphone, holding it safely out of her desperate reach. "I am not a helpless child anymore, Mother," I replied calmly. My voice projected clearly and powerfully over the massive sound system, so the entire furious, chaotic ballroom could hear her desperate, pathetic lies. "And these documents displayed behind me are absolutely not fabrications. They are the direct, verified result of a federal forensic audit conducted by my private agency over the last 72 hours. You can try to deny it all you want to these people, But every single investor standing in this room is currently watching their hard-earned money disappear into the offshore shadow accounts that you personally helped Liam create and hide from the government. Beatrice finally realized she could not overpower me physically, and she absolutely could not dispute the irrefutable mathematical evidence glowing brightly on the massive screens above us. She turned her manic, terrified attention to the private security team lining the walls of the grand ballroom. "What are you incompetent idiots waiting for?" she barked, her voice echoing with tyrannical absolute authority over the murmuring crowd. "I pay your exorbitant salaries to protect me. Arrest this dangerous woman immediately. She is trespassing on my private event and committing severe illegal corporate slander against my family and my trusted business partners. Drag her out of my building right now and call the local police to have her locked away in a cell where she belongs." 6 heavily armed private security guards stepped forward from the dark shadows of the arched decorative doorways. They wore crisp black suits with communication earpieces and moved with intimidating strict military precision toward the stage. Beatrice smiled a wicked, triumphant, nasty smile, believing that her ultimate social authority was finally about to be enforced through sheer physical force. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest and waited for the guards to lay their rough hands on me. She fully expected them to grab my arms and throw me out into the cold, dark street, just like my father had done 23 years ago, when I was only 9. The head of the estate security team, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern, unforgiving face, stepped up onto the elevated marble landing. But he did not walk toward me with malicious intent. Instead, he stepped directly between Beatrice and me, positioning his large, imposing body as a protective physical shield facing my mother. Beatrice looked at him in absolute total confusion, her triumphant, wicked smile instantly faltering. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising in shrill, terrifying panic as she looked at the broad back of the security chief. "I gave you a direct, explicit order to arrest her right this instant and remove her from my gala." The head of security stood perfectly still, his hands clasped firmly and respectfully in front of him. "Apologies, Madame Beatrice," he said, his deep, resonant voice carrying clearly and undeniably across the stunned and utterly silent ballroom. "But we only take our direct orders from the true legal owner of this massive historic estate." He turned slightly away from my mother and bowed his head toward me in a beautiful gesture of profound, absolute respect. Every single person in the massive grand ballroom, from the panicked wealthy investors to the weeping hysterical Chloe, to the terrified trembling Liam, stopped breathing entirely. They all turned their heads and stared in absolute total shock at the woman standing in the crimson gown, wearing the legendary black diamond necklace. The terrifying realization hit Beatrice with the destructive, lethal force of a freight train, and the true battle for the Washington Empire reached its glorious breaking point. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom felt like a physical weight pressing down on the remaining guests. Beatrice stood absolutely frozen as the head of estate security bowed his head toward me in front of the entire Atlanta elite. She realized in that singular, agonizing moment that the ground beneath her feet was completely gone. The social empire she had ruthlessly built over 2 decades was evaporating into thin air. Chloe was still weeping on the marble floor, holding her face in her hands, while Liam stared at the massive screens displaying his massive financial crimes. I did not stay to watch them suffer any further. I simply turned around and walked back down the long red carpet, my crimson silk gown trailing behind me like a blazing fire. I stepped into my waiting vehicle and instructed the driver to take me back to the Waldorf Astoria. I had spent 23 years waiting for this exact weekend, and I knew that the real battle was going to take place on Monday morning. Beatrice was not the kind of woman to surrender gracefully. She was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always fight back with vicious, desperate measures. I spent the entire weekend inside the presidential suite, finalizing the legal documents with Attorney Sterling and Agent Davis. We monitored the frantic communications coming from my mother's camp. Beatrice had spent Saturday and Sunday desperately calling every corrupt board member and shadow investor she had in her pocket. She was trying to arrange a final corporate coup to strip me of my family name and block my access to the corporate accounts before the federal authorities could officially freeze her assets. She did not know that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was already waiting for my signal. Monday morning arrived with dark, heavy rain clouds rolling across the Atlanta skyline. It was the perfect weather for a corporate execution. I dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored slate gray business suit. I left the heavy diamond necklace secured in the federal safe house because today was not about social theatrics. Today was about raw, absolute corporate power. I gathered the thick leather binder containing the blind trust documents and walked out to my waiting car. The Washington Group headquarters was a towering glass and steel skyscraper located right in the heart of the financial district. My father had built this building from the ground up, and my mother had spent the last 2 decades using it as a fortress for her money laundering syndicate. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the massive marble lobby. The security guards at the front desk immediately recognized me from the viral news reports of the charity gala. They did not ask for my identification or try to stop me from entering the private executive elevators. They simply stepped back and watched me with wide, terrified eyes. I pressed the button for the top floor and felt the elevator shoot upward, carrying me toward the final confrontation. Inside the massive executive boardroom on the top floor, Beatrice had gathered her most loyal and corrupt board members for an emergency meeting. The long, polished mahogany table was surrounded by wealthy men and women who had profited immensely from her illegal activities. Liam was sitting near the back of the room, looking entirely haggard and sick. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands trembled as he held a cup of coffee. The reality of his impending federal prison sentence had clearly kept him awake for the last 48 hours. Chloe was sitting next to him wearing dark sunglasses indoors to hide her swollen, bloodshot eyes. She had lost her multi-million-dollar mansion, her credit cards, and her social standing all in a single weekend. Beatrice stood at the head of the long table wearing a severe black suit. She looked exhausted, but her eyes burned with a manic, desperate energy. She was holding a thick stack of papers in her hands and speaking rapidly to the confused board members. She was spinning a frantic, chaotic narrative, claiming that I was a deeply disturbed and dangerous individual who had hired professional hackers to fabricate the financial reports shown at the gala. She was telling the board that I was trying to destroy the family legacy out of pure spite and jealousy. She slapped the papers down onto the mahogany table and demanded that the board vote immediately to officially strip me of my family name and remove my security clearance from all corporate properties. She told them she had a newly discovered legal document from my late father that proved he intended to disinherit me completely. It was a forged will. She had spent the entire weekend paying top dollar to underground forgery experts trying to create a fake legal document that would override whatever claims I had to the company. She thought that if she could get the board of directors to vote on the forged will, she could legally block me from entering the building and buy herself enough time to flee the country with the remaining cartel money. She was speaking so loudly and passionately that no one noticed the heavy glass doors of the boardroom slowly swinging open. I walked into the massive room with silent, measured steps. My custom slate gray suit commanded immediate respect, and my posture was completely relaxed. The thick leather binder resting under my arm contained the true absolute destiny of the Washington Group. One of the board members sitting near the door gasped audibly when he saw me entering the room. The sound caused a ripple effect around the long mahogany table. One by one, the corrupt executives stopped listening to my mother's frantic speech and turned their heads to stare at me in profound shock. Beatrice stopped speaking mid-sentence. She slowly turned her head toward the doorway, and when her eyes locked onto mine, the last remaining drops of color vanished entirely from her face. She looked like she had just been struck by lightning. Chloe let out a small, terrified whimper and sank lower into her leather chair, desperately trying to hide behind her large, dark sunglasses. Liam completely froze, staring at me, as if I were the angel of death coming to collect his soul. I did not say a single word to any of them. I did not acknowledge the confused board members or the terrified family members. I simply walked the entire length of the massive room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. I walked straight toward the head of the table where my mother was currently standing. Beatrice watched me approach, her hands gripping the edges of the mahogany table so tightly that her knuckles were pure white. She tried to maintain her authoritative posture, but her entire body was trembling with absolute terror. I stopped right next to her. I looked down at the forged will resting on the table, and then I looked directly into her manic, terrified eyes. I reached out and calmly pulled the heavy leather chairman chair away from the table. "Get up right now," Beatrice roared, her voice cracking with sheer desperate panic. "That is my seat. You have no right to be in this building. Security should have stopped you in the lobby. You are a trespassing criminal and I am having you arrested." I did not flinch at her screaming. I simply sat down directly in the chairman's seat at the head of the table. I leaned back into the comfortable leather and crossed my legs, projecting absolute total dominance over the entire room. I placed the thick leather binder onto the mahogany table right on top of her forged documents. I looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with every single board member sitting at the table. These were the people who had helped my mother launder millions of dollars for dangerous criminals. These were the people who had profited from my father's death and my 23 years of painful exile. "Open your eyes," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that echoed clearly in the silent boardroom. "Every single document my mother just showed you is a complete and utter fabrication. She is attempting to execute a fraudulent corporate coup because she knows that her time has officially run out." Beatrice slammed her fist onto the table. "Do not listen to her," she screamed at the board members. "She is a psychotic liar. I am the managing director of this corporation, and I am ordering a vote right now to have her permanently removed from the premises." I slowly opened my leather binder and pulled out the original certified documents of the blind trust my father had established 23 years ago. I slid the heavy stack of papers down the center of the polished mahogany table so that the senior legal counsel of the board could see them clearly. "You cannot vote me out, Mother," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady, "because you do not have the power to do anything in this room anymore." 23 years ago, my father placed 60% of the voting shares of this entire empire into an irrevocable blind trust. He did it to protect the company from your massive money laundering operations and to ensure that you could never fully control his legacy. The board members leaned forward, staring at the certified legal documents with wide, panicked eyes. The senior legal counsel picked up the papers and began reading them rapidly, his face turning a sickening shade of gray as he realized the documents were absolutely legitimate and legally binding. The terms of the blind trust were very simple. I continued, making sure my voice reached every corner of the massive room. The trust was programmed to transfer full absolute ownership of those controlling shares directly to me. I turned 32 years old on Saturday night. As of this exact moment, I legally hold 60% of the voting shares of the Washington Group. I am the majority shareholder. I am the chairman of the board. And I am the sole owner of this entire corporate empire. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sob, pulling off her sunglasses to reveal her swollen, tear-stained face. "You cannot do this to us!" she cried out, her voice breaking with desperate entitlement. "We are your family. You cannot just walk in here and take everything away from us." I turned my cold gaze toward my younger sister. "I am not taking anything away, Chloe," I replied softly. "I am simply reclaiming what my father built. And as my first official act as the new chairman of the board, I am conducting a complete executive restructuring." I looked at Beatrice, who was gripping the table, trying to stop her knees from buckling. I looked at Liam, who had buried his face in his hands. And I looked at Chloe, who was weeping uncontrollably. "You, Beatrice," I said, pointing a single manicured finger at her, "are officially fired. You, Liam, are officially fired. And you, Chloe, are officially fired. You are all permanently terminated from the Washington Group effective immediately. You will surrender your corporate access badges, your keys, and your electronic devices before you leave this room. You have absolutely no power, no money, and no future in this city." The entire boardroom remained dead silent as my words settled over them. Then suddenly Beatrice began to laugh. It was a dark, manic, terrifying sound. She reached into her expensive designer bag and violently pulled out a thick yellow medical file, slapping it aggressively onto the center of the mahogany table for everyone to see. "You actually think you won this pathetic little game," she hissed, her dark eyes gleaming with pure, unadulterated demonic joy as she stared directly at my calm face. I have documents proving you were diagnosed with severe schizophrenia at 18. Your single signature on all these corporate documents is completely and legally void. I looked down at the yellow folder resting on the wood. I did not even bother to reach out and open it to read the lies she had paid a corrupt doctor to write. She expected me to panic. She expected me to scream and defend my sanity in front of the silent board of directors. She wanted to turn the boardroom into a spectacle where I looked like a raving lunatic, validating her forged medical claims. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle in my face to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply leaned back further into the heavy leather chairman seat and looked at her with an expression of pure, absolute boredom. The corrupt board members sitting around the long table shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of who held the real power in the room anymore. Liam let out a shaky breath of relief, his arrogant posture returning slightly as he desperately clung to the false hope that his mother-in-law had just saved him from a federal prison sentence. Chloe peeked out from behind her dark sunglasses, a nasty little smirk forming on her tear-stained face as she waited for security to drag me away to a psychiatric ward. "You are grasping at ghosts, Beatrice," I said, my voice completely calm and devoid of any emotion. "A fake medical file is not going to stop the momentum of a 23-year-old blind trust, and it certainly is not going to stop the federal authorities who are already monitoring your every move." Beatrice laughed again, a shrill grating sound that echoed off the glass walls of the skyscraper. "You have no authority here, Zuri," she hissed, pointing a sharp manicured finger at my face. "You are a sick, delusional woman, and I am calling the hospital right now to have you committed for your own safety. The board will never accept a single document signed by a certified schizophrenic. Your hostile takeover is officially over." I slowly reached my right hand into the inner pocket of my custom-tailored slate gray suit. Beatrice stopped laughing, her eyes darting to my hand as a sudden flash of paranoia crossed her features. I pulled out a small, sleek black remote control and rested it on the mahogany table right next to the certified blind trust documents. Attorney Sterling had given me this remote early this morning with strict instructions on when to use it. This was the final weapon my father had prepared. This was the kill shot. "I am not the one taking over this company, Mother," I replied, my fingers lightly brushing the smooth plastic of the remote. "I am just the messenger carrying out the final will of the man you murdered." I pressed the single silver button on the remote. The heavy motorized blackout blinds covering the floor-to-ceiling windows immediately began to lower, casting the massive executive boardroom into a cold, tense darkness. The corrupt executives gasped in surprise as the lighting in the room automatically dimmed to a theater setting. The massive high-definition presentation screen mounted on the far wall behind Beatrice flickered to life with a loud digital hum. Every single head in the room turned to stare at the glowing monitor. The screen displayed a wall of static for a brief second before an encrypted video file decoded itself and began to play. The grainy, low-resolution footage clearly indicated that the video had been recorded over 2 decades ago. The digital timestamp in the bottom corner proved it was filmed just 3 days before my father's fatal car crash. The image stabilized, and a man appeared on the massive screen. It was my father, Richard Washington. He was sitting behind the very same mahogany desk that currently anchored this room, but he looked entirely different than the tearful, desperate man I had seen in the video at the airport. There was no sorrow in his eyes now. There was only a cold, ruthless, and terrifying fury. He was not speaking to his beloved daughter anymore. He was speaking directly to his killer. "Beatrice," he said, his deep, booming voice vibrating through the advanced surround sound speakers of the boardroom. "If you are watching this video right now in this very room, it means that my beautiful, brilliant daughter Zuri has finally grown powerful enough to strip you of absolutely everything you hold dear. It means that she has taken her rightful place at the head of this table, and you are currently standing before her completely, utterly defeated." Beatrice let out a choked, horrified gasp. She stumbled backward, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She bumped into the edge of the screen, her hands reaching out blindly to steady herself as she stared up at the towering image of her dead husband. The board members sat frozen in their expensive leather chairs, their faces turning a collective shade of ashen gray as they realized they were watching a broadcast from the grave. Liam gripped the edges of the table so hard his fingernails threatened to snap. Chloe began to cry again, this time not out of entitlement but out of pure visceral terror. "I know exactly what you did, Beatrice," my father's voice echoed relentlessly through the dark room. "You thought you were so clever. You thought you could use my company to launder millions of dollars for the cartel, and I would just turn a blind eye to keep the peace in our family. And when I threatened to expose you to the authorities, you decided that my life was an acceptable price to pay for your greed. I know you paid a mechanic to cut the brake lines on my sedan, Beatrice. I know you orchestrated my death to look like a tragic accident, so you could steal my empire and play the role of the grieving widow." Beatrice began to shake violently. "No," she whimpered, her voice barely a whisper as she shook her head back and forth. "No, that is a lie. Turn it off. Somebody turn it off." She frantically looked around the room, begging the corrupt executives to intervene, but no one moved a single inch. They were entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the confession playing out before them. They were trapped in a dark room listening to a murdered man testify against their leader. "You thought you won," my father continued on the screen, his eyes staring relentlessly into the camera lens, looking across 23 years of time to pierce directly into my mother's dark soul. "You thought that throwing Zuri out into the street was a victory. You thought you had eliminated the only heir who could ever challenge your authority. But you never realized that you were just a rat running on a wheel inside a cage that I built for you. I let you think you got away with murder, Beatrice. I let you take over the board of directors. I let you sit in my building and wear your expensive clothes and throw your lavish parties because I needed you to be the temporary caretaker of my wealth until Zuri was old enough to crush you." The psychological collapse of the ruthless matriarch happened in slow, agonizing real time. The arrogant sneer that had defined Beatrice Washington for her entire life melted away completely. Her pristine, severe posture crumbled, causing her shoulders to hunch forward like a withered, broken old woman. The yellow medical file she had brought to destroy me slipped from her trembling fingers and fell onto the floor, scattering its useless forged papers across the carpet. "Every single day for the last 2 decades, you thought you were the supreme queen of the Atlanta elite," my father's voice boomed, carrying a heavy, triumphant finality. "But you were nothing but a glorified security guard, protecting an empire you never actually owned. You lived your entire life in a blinding illusion, Beatrice. And now the illusion is over." This video, along with the original, unedited financial ledgers detailing every single cartel transaction you ever authorized, has already been sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There is nowhere left to run. Your empire is dead, and my daughter is the one holding the match. The screen abruptly cut to black, throwing the front of the boardroom into heavy shadows. The only light remaining was the dim emergency lighting running along the baseboards. The silence that followed the video was absolute and deafening. The air in the room felt entirely depleted of oxygen. Beatrice stood swaying in the darkness, her face a pale, withered mask of absolute horror. The reality of her existence had just been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She had spent 23 years walking through life with the supreme confidence of a criminal mastermind who had successfully committed the perfect murder. She had looked down on everyone around her, believing her intellect and her ruthlessness were unmatched. And in less than 5 minutes, a pre-recorded message from a dead man had completely dismantled her entire reality. She realized with crushing, agonizing clarity that she had never been the puppet master. She had always been the puppet dancing on strings pulled by my father from beyond the grave. Every dollar she spent, every party she hosted, every breath she took over the last 2 decades was only permitted because my father had allowed it to buy me time to grow into a weapon. Liam suddenly broke the silence with a loud, desperate sobbing sound. The arrogant white hedge fund manager dropped his head onto the polished mahogany table, hyperventilating as the terrifying reality of the FBI investigation crashed down upon him. He knew that if the FBI had the original cartel ledgers, his own financial crimes would be exposed to the federal government within minutes. Chloe curled her body into a tight ball in her chair, wrapping her arms around her knees and rocking back and forth, muttering incoherent pleas to a mother who could no longer save her. The corrupt board members began whispering frantically to each other, shooting terrified glances toward the locked glass doors of the boardroom, realizing that they were all sitting in a room that was about to become the epicenter of a massive federal raid. I remained seated in the chairman chair, perfectly composed. I did not feel an ounce of pity for any of them. I watched the woman who had happily planned to drown me in the Caribbean Sea slowly slide down the wall and collapse onto the floor. Beatrice sat on the carpet surrounded by her fake medical documents, her empty hands grasping at the air as if trying to catch the fading remnants of her power. Her lips moved silently, unable to form words as her mind completely broke under the weight of her monumental failure. The silence in the room was suddenly broken by a faint sound drifting up from the city streets below. It started as a low, distant wail barely audible through the thick, reinforced glass windows of the skyscraper. But within seconds, the sound grew louder, multiplying and layering upon itself. The piercing, rhythmic sound of multiple police sirens began to fill the air, echoing off the surrounding concrete and steel buildings. The wailing grew closer and more intense, completely surrounding the base of the corporate tower. The red and blue flashing lights reflecting off the adjacent buildings proved that the authorities had arrived in massive numbers. The net had been pulled tight. The trap was finally closed. The FBI was here, and the reign of the Washington criminal syndicate was officially over. I sat back in my leather chair, crossing my hands over the blind trust portfolio, and waited for the heavy glass doors to burst open. The heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom were violently shattered inward by the sheer force of the Federal Bureau of Investigation tactical team. Dozens of heavily armed agents poured into the massive room, their dark uniforms stark against the polished mahogany and expensive leather interior. Agent Davis walked in right behind them, holding a thick stack of federal arrest warrants in his hands. The atmosphere instantly shifted to pure chaotic panic. The corrupt board members, who had been sitting frozen in their chairs, suddenly scrambled backward, knocking over their expensive coffee cups and dropping their fake legal documents onto the floor. They tried to raise their hands and back away from the table, completely desperate to distance themselves from my mother. Beatrice was still sitting on the carpet, her back pressed against the cold glass window. She looked up at the armed agents with empty, hollow eyes, completely unable to process the reality of her own destruction. Agent Davis walked directly toward the head of the table where Liam was currently hyperventilating. "Liam Davies, you are under arrest for massive federal financial fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit murder," Agent Davis announced, his voice booming through the chaotic room. Liam completely lost whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. The arrogant, wealthy white hedge fund manager who had treated me like garbage in Saint Barts suddenly dropped to his knees right there on the expensive boardroom carpet. He began sobbing uncontrollably, tears running down his pale face as he grabbed at Agent Davis' dark trousers. "Please, you have to listen to me," Liam cried, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "I did not want to do this. She forced me to do it. Beatrice made me steal the money from the investors. She threatened to ruin my life if I did not help her wash the cartel cash. I will tell you everything you want to know. I will give you all the names and all the offshore routing numbers. Just please give me a plea deal and keep me out of federal prison." The entire room watched in absolute disgust as Liam begged like a coward, turning on his own family the second he faced real consequences. Beatrice pushed herself up from the floor. Her face was a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated demonic rage. She stumbled toward Liam, her expensive black suit wrinkled and covered in dust from the floor. "You pathetic, weak, useless little rat!" Beatrice hissed, her voice dripping with absolute venom. She raised her right hand and delivered a stinging, violent slap across Liam's face. The loud smack echoed sharply in the large boardroom, silencing his pathetic sobbing. Liam recoiled, holding his bright red cheek as he cowered on the floor. "You are a disgrace to this family!" Beatrice screamed at him, completely ignoring the dozens of federal agents surrounding them. "I gave you everything, and you fold at the very first sign of trouble." Agent Davis did not even blink at the violent outburst. He simply gestured to two of his tactical agents, who immediately grabbed Liam by the arms and dragged him up from the floor. They pulled his arms behind his back and secured heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists. Liam continued to weep loudly, begging the agents to listen to him as they marched him out of the room. Beatrice turned her manic, furious eyes toward me. She stood there breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as she stared at me sitting calmly in the chairman's seat. She wanted to say something to me. She wanted to hurl one last toxic insult to diminish my profound victory. But as she looked at my face, she realized that nothing she said would ever affect me again. I was wearing a custom slate gray business suit, and I held the absolute legal control of the entire Washington Empire. She was wearing handcuffs and facing a life sentence in federal prison. Agent Davis stepped forward, securing her wrists behind her back. Beatrice Washington, you are under arrest for the murder of Richard Washington and multiple counts of federal racketeering, Agent Davis said, pulling her toward the door. She did not fight him. She simply let her head drop forward, completely broken and utterly defeated. As the federal agents began clearing the room of the corrupt board members, securing the area for their massive financial raid, a loud, pathetic wail broke the remaining tension. Chloe had been hiding behind her leather chair the entire time, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the nightmare unfolding around her. She realized that her mother was going to prison. She realized that her husband was a cowardly criminal who had just lost all of their stolen money. And most importantly, she realized that she was now completely alone in the world, with absolutely no money, no power, and no elite social standing. The golden child who had spent her entire life being pampered and spoiled beyond measure was suddenly stripped of every single cent she had ever claimed to own. Chloe crawled out from behind the chair and scrambled across the polished hardwood floor. She threw herself at my feet, grabbing my ankles with both of her shaking hands. She looked up at me, her designer sunglasses discarded on the floor, her face red and swollen from crying. "Sister, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with desperate, frantic entitlement. "I did not know anything about the murder. I did not know about the cartel money. I am just your little sister. You cannot let them take everything away from me. I do not know how to survive out there without the family money. Please let me stay here with you. I will do whatever you want. I will be your assistant. Just please do not throw me out into the street. I have nowhere else to go." I looked down at the weeping, pathetic woman clinging to my ankles. This was the same sister who had proudly flaunted her stolen diamond ring at the Michelin-starred restaurant just days ago. This was the same sister who had laughed when Liam threw the dinner bill at my feet. This was the sister who had happily planned to watch me drown in the Caribbean Sea so she could inherit my stolen wealth. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy for her. I reached down and calmly pried her desperate fingers off my legs. I stood up and smoothed the fabric of my slate gray suit. I looked at Chloe, who was kneeling on the floor looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I reached into the pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a single crisp $100 bill. It was the exact same denomination that my father had used in his theatrical act to throw me out of the house when I was 9 years old. I held the green paper in my hand for a brief moment, feeling the heavy poetic justice of this singular exchange. I looked down at Chloe and let the $100 bill slip from my fingers. It fluttered slowly through the air and landed on the carpet right in front of her trembling knees. "Take this $100. I said, my voice completely cold and devoid of any familial warmth. "Pick it up, walk out that glass door, and never speak my name again. Consider this your very first lesson in true independence." Chloe stared at the money on the floor, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock. She realized that I was completely serious. I was leaving her with exactly what I had been given 23 years ago: a single bill and a lifetime of harsh reality to face on her own. Two federal marshals stepped forward and grabbed Chloe by her arms, pulling her up from the floor. They did not handcuff her because she was not facing criminal charges, but they were ordered to escort her entirely off the premises. Chloe wept loudly as they dragged her out of the boardroom, leaving the $100 bill resting untouched on the carpet. The final moments of the Washington criminal syndicate were broadcast live to the entire world. Local and national media networks had received anonymous tips about the massive federal raid, and hundreds of news vans had surrounded the corporate tower. As the federal tactical team escorted Beatrice Liam and the corrupt executives out through the main glass doors of the lobby, they were immediately blinded by the relentless flashing of countless camera lenses. Reporters shouted frantic questions, shoving microphones toward the disgraced elite. Beatrice kept her head down, unable to face the bright lights of the very society she had once ruthlessly ruled. Liam wept openly, shielding his face from the cameras like a pathetic broken coward. The villains were walked straight into the back of waiting armored vehicles, their fake empire officially reduced to ash. The flashing lights of the media cameras faded into the distance as the armored federal vehicles drove away, carrying the architects of my suffering off to their permanent ruin. The massive corporate lobby of the Washington Group building was finally quiet after the chaos of the federal raid subsided. I stood alone by the towering glass windows, watching the rain wash the city streets clean. The empire that my father built was finally purged of the toxic venom that my mother had injected into its very foundation for over 2 decades. Attorney Sterling walked up beside me, his wooden cane tapping softly against the polished marble floor. He did not speak right away. He just stood there looking out at the Atlanta skyline with a profound sense of peace settling over his tired, aged features. We had done it. We had executed the final phase of my father's brilliant master plan and dismantled a massive criminal syndicate without firing a single physical shot. The days that followed the dramatic boardroom coup were a relentless whirlwind of intense legal proceedings and massive federal indictments. The federal prosecutors built an airtight case against Beatrice and Liam using the original unedited financial ledgers my father had secretly preserved before his murder. Liam cracked completely under the intense pressure of the federal interrogation room. The arrogant white hedge fund manager, who used to sneer at me across expensive restaurant tables, spent hours weeping and confessing to every single financial crime he had ever committed. He provided the authorities with the exact locations of every offshore bank account and shadow corporation they had used to wash the cartel money. Despite his pathetic attempts to secure a lenient plea deal, the sheer magnitude of his financial fraud guaranteed his absolute destruction. The judge sentenced Liam to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Beatrice faced an even darker and more severe fate. The prosecutors charged my mother with first-degree, premeditated murder for cutting the brake lines on my father's car 23 years ago. She sat in the cold courtroom looking utterly hollow and withered. The powerful, intimidating queen of the Atlanta black elite had been completely stripped of her designer gowns, her expensive jewelry, and her false dignity. She was forced to wear a bright orange prison jumpsuit and sit silently while the jury delivered a unanimous guilty verdict. The judge sentenced Beatrice to 2 consecutive life sentences to be served in a maximum security federal penitentiary. She would never breathe free air or see the bright city lights of Atlanta ever again. Chloe faced a very different kind of miserable punishment. She was not directly involved in the cartel money laundering or the murder plot, so the federal authorities did not file criminal charges against her. But her entire life had been completely funded by the stolen corporate money that I had just legally repossessed. The spoiled golden child was suddenly stripped of every single cent she had ever claimed to own. The Washington Group officially repossessed the massive Buckhead mansion, and the bank seized all of her luxury vehicles. Her wealthy high society friends immediately abandoned her the moment her bank accounts were frozen, leaving her entirely isolated and destitute. 6 months after the massive federal raid, I drove my car past a dingy, run-down gas station on the outskirts of the city. I looked through the dirty glass window and saw Chloe standing behind the cash register. She was wearing a cheap stained polyester uniform and ringing up customers to earn a minimum wage salary. The girl who had proudly flaunted a flawless diamond ring and mocked my modest accountant's salary was now facing the brutal, crushing reality of the deep poverty she had once so viciously despised. I did not stop the car or go inside to gloat. Watching her live her miserable new reality from a distance was satisfying enough. With the toxic venom permanently removed from the family bloodline, I turned my full, absolute attention to completely rebuilding the Washington Group empire. Taking full control of the massive corporation was a monumental task, but my extensive background as a relentless forensic accountant had prepared me perfectly for the challenge. I spent the first 90 days executing a massive, comprehensive corporate sweep. I systematically hunted down and fired every single corrupt board member and dishonest executive who had ever enabled my mother's criminal operations. I replaced them with a diverse, intelligent, and highly ethical team of brilliant professionals who shared my exact vision for a clean, transparent future. The corporate restructuring completely revitalized the company, restoring investor confidence and doubling our profit margins within the very first year. But I did not just want to build more personal wealth. I wanted to use my massive, newly acquired resources to create a powerful, lasting legacy that would truly honor my father's profound sacrifice. I took $75 million from the corporate treasury and established the Richard Washington Foundation. The foundation was specifically designed to provide free, aggressive legal representation and comprehensive financial protection for young children who were suffering from severe familial abuse and targeted economic exploitation. I hired top-tier attorneys and dedicated social workers to actively rescue vulnerable kids from toxic, manipulative parents, ensuring they would never have to experience the agonizing, crushing trauma of being thrown out onto the street with nothing but a worthless $100 bill. The foundation became my ultimate passion project, transforming the darkest, most agonizing moments of my childhood into a brilliant beacon of hope and absolute safety for thousands of innocent kids across the country. Exactly 1 year after the dramatic corporate takeover, I found myself standing alone on a quiet, rolling green hill in the most peaceful cemetery in Atlanta. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the gentle scent of pine trees and fresh rain. I walked slowly over the damp grass until I reached a pristine white marble headstone bearing my father's name. I stood there for a very long time, just looking at the engraved letters. The heavy, crippling weight of the bitter hatred I had carried for 23 years was entirely, completely gone. It had been washed away by the beautiful, profound truth of his hidden, boundless love. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a sleek silver frame. Inside the frame was a pristine copy of the latest edition of Forbes magazine. The glossy cover featured a high-definition photograph of me sitting proudly in the massive chairman chair at the Washington Group headquarters. The bold text across the front page called me the fierce, brilliant visionary who single-handedly saved a multi-billion-dollar empire from utter destruction. I knelt down on the damp grass and gently leaned the framed magazine against the solid white marble of his headstone. I wanted him to see it. I wanted him to know that his monumental, excruciating sacrifice had not been made in vain. His little girl had not just survived the darkness, she had completely conquered it. I reached up and let my fingers brush against the heavy, cold platinum chain resting around my neck. The legendary Panther's Eye diamond necklace sat perfectly against my collarbone, anchoring me to my true, rightful legacy. It was no longer a cursed, stolen object hunted by a ruthless murderess. It was a beautiful, heavy symbol of my absolute triumph and my father's eternal, enduring protection. I closed my eyes and let a deep, long breath escape my lungs. A small, genuine smile of pure, profound relief and total vindication slowly spread across my face. My revenge was never really just about taking back a massive corporate empire or destroying the toxic villains who had tried to drown me in the ocean. It was the ultimate, complete exoneration of my father's secret, desperate love. He had played the role of a cruel, heartless monster so that I could one day become an untouchable, powerful queen. I stood up and smoothed the fabric of my elegant black trench coat. I looked at the white marble headstone one last time, silently thanking the man who gave me everything by pretending to give me nothing. I turned around and began walking back down the long green hill toward my waiting car. My footsteps were steady, measured, and incredibly light. My head was held high and my posture was completely unbroken. I was finally walking entirely free from the shadows of my past, stepping boldly into the brilliant, endless light of my own magnificent future. I was the absolute true and undisputed queen of my own life. The gentle breeze caught the edge of my coat as I reached the black town car, waiting faithfully at the bottom of the long, winding gravel path. The driver opened the heavy rear door, bowing slightly in a gesture of profound, unforced respect. I slipped into the soft leather seat and looked out the dark-tinted passenger glass window. True power does not come from the family you are born into, but from the resilience you build in the dark. Her journey teaches us that betrayal and rejection can be weapons yet. Sometimes they conceal a much deeper sacrifice. When toxic people underestimate your worth, you must silently gather your strength and rewrite your own narrative. True justice is never about mindless revenge. It is about reclaiming your stolen truth and completely dismantling the false empires built on toxic lies. Ultimately, the absolute greatest victory is walking away from the painful shadows of your past and ruling your destiny. If you are ready to stop being the victim and start building your own unbreakable empire, hit that subscribe button and share your story in the comments below.